Ahead and start. Welcome back to Commerce Committee. I, for one, am very excited about this year. We've got a lot of good things going to happen. We've got a lot of agreements on a lot of controversial bills. And so this will be the easiest session we've had since I've been chair, I promise. We do have some new people here on staff that I'd like to hear from or introduce. Research, we have Mike Ditch. You want to go ahead and introduce yourself, kind of give us a little background?
Mike Ditch, Legislative Research, first session. Got to serve a little bit in the interim, but this is first session for me. Thanks.
Well, welcome. We're pretty much the easiest committee that we got going on up here. So, Lance Capshaw, right? New audio visual. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Lance Capshaw for the AV department. I've been assigned to this room for the session. If you have any audio video questions or anything, just feel free to let me know or shoot me an email.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome to Commerce Committee. Charles made a new rule, and so he wants to talk to us. Reviser Reimer.
So first of all, the glasses are because of cataract surgery, not a fashion statement. So as many of you probably know, there's a new rule by House leadership that the request for information is now going to be put on the bill. So just to note that for those folks making bill requests in committee, that they be clear about themselves, and also if they're requesting the bill on behalf of an entity or another person, that they're clear about who they're requesting it for, so we can get that information down for the bill and also for the minutes. Thank you.
Okay, well, bill introductions are coming up here real soon, so I hope you all paid attention to that. I'd also like to welcome Representative Blue to committee. She is Representative Patton's improvement replacement. And so welcome to committee. Okay, with that, are there any bill introductions? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a bill for a National Guard tax credit. The RS number is 24 RS 2316, and it's a tax credit for employers that employ members of the Kansas Army and Air National Guard, and establishing an income tax credit for employees.
Okay, hell, I forgot the words. It's been so long. Without objection, we'll accept it. Thank you. Whitney Dameron.
Sorry, we have a bill 24 RS 2401 relating to termination of rental agreements and effectiveness of agreements delivered electronically and disposition of certain property. We appreciate the committee's indulgence to introduce this bill, and we hope it keeps with the spirit of the chairman and things are easy and go well.
Thank you for your well wishes. Without seeing no objection, we'll accept the bill.
Thank you.
Any other bill introductions? Eric Stafford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Happy 2024. Eric Stafford on behalf of the Kansas Chamber with a bill request for RS 242188, I believe is the number 2188, and it's a bill dealing with rules and regulations and legislative oversight.
Okay, seeing no objection, we'll introduce the bill.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Charles, did everybody follow the rules so far? Okay. Any other bill introductions? Seeing none, we'll move on to the first item on our agenda, and that will be Ellen Cobb, President CEO of Kansas Chamber.
Thank you,
Welcome
Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Alan Cobb, President and CEO of the Kansas Chamber. For 19 years, we have done a survey. We're pulling it up here. Lance is getting it, I think, on the screen. And I think I've done this a few times in this committee. There's a lot of data in these. You obviously will have a copy of it. And for anybody in the audience, I can get you a copy. The things that I think you may not be interested in, I may speed up, but feel free to stop or ask me to go back. So what we've done for 19 years in a row, we've surveyed 300 business owners and executives in the state of Kansas. You can next slide. And next slide. So the audience or the universe in which we poll is representative of the industries and the size of businesses in Kansas. A couple things that usually get asked questions. We don't know whether these are chamber members or not. We go through Dun and Bradstreet. They could very well be chamber members, but not necessarily. So next slide. This is kind of a fundamental poll question that folks ask, whether it's issue polling or candidate polling. Are we on the right or the wrong track? And you see things started really headed south literally during COVID and haven't really recovered. And the next slide goes through the detail of different media markets. So again, I'm going to probably move past those because there's, except for a couple things, there are, it's relative consistency across the state, but not always. Next slide, opinion of Kansas futures. So again, feel free to stop me in any of those. Despite some of the bad track numbers, optimism about the future is still solid. The 64% ties for the lowest number we've seen. Just a reminder, business owners, business CEOs are ultimately optimistic if they're going to take some of the risk in which they do. But 64% optimistic opinion of the Kansas future and 27. Next slide is divided by media markets. Again, or the size of employees. Again, relative consistency, although it's certainly the larger businesses. And having 50 plus employees is hardly a large business, but the larger businesses are more optimistic. Next slide. Now, this one may generate some questions because I think during my almost 7 years of the chamber, one thing I've consistently heard from all of our members of all sizes is the need for workers and not enough employees, et cetera. Well, these CEOs looks like they're planning on decreasing their workforce. And so one thing with the state or the federal data, as far as the number of private sector jobs added, et cetera, there's always a lag, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. So maybe this is a leading indicator. I don't know, but we're going to take a look when the data comes out in June and July. So the next slide is, again, the same question asked with different different industry sectors. Next slide, workforce size over the next year. 54% of respondents are optimistic about the future. Only 26 say they will increase their workforce in the coming year. Almost 4 times as many say they will decrease it. Next slide again is the industry sector. Larger companies a little bit more bullish, and there's certainly some hesitancy in the ag sector. Next slide is an open-ended question. What is the most important for Kansas businesses? Taxes is back to the top issue. It's the highest we've seen since 2019, and now it eclipses those whose top concern was the workforce. And COVID certainly exacerbated some of those things. And you'll see some results of COVID before and after, I think, in some of this poll data. Again, this is open-ended. We did not suggest it. The next is a word wall, just to give you an idea of the words that were used by the respondents. And obviously tax is very, very prominent. Next slide. It shows how dominant tax policy was prior to the pandemic, and it looks to be returning. Obviously, during the pandemic, there were lots of concerns about just simply keeping doors open. Next slide, most important to profitability, and you can have up to 2 selections. So you still see issues of taxation and regulations, et cetera. Nothing, again, and you see the consistency over in the slide, we go back to 2008. And we started doing it, I believe, 2004, 2005, but those numbers, it's fairly consistent, kind of amazing. It's as consistent as it is on all of those issues. Next slide. Just more numbers on what is by the media markets. So fuel cost, and we don't differentiate necessarily between electricity and fuel in automobiles, but it certainly spiked in ag manufacturing and construction. I would guess that's from diesel fuel and gasoline because of the amount that's used transporting goods, et cetera. And obviously ag is a big fuel user. Now, this next question is not going to be a surprise to any of you. Most of the business owners, CEOs think they pay too much in taxes. Very few think they don't pay enough. Again, I don't think this is a shocking piece of data. And next slide is just by media market. Again, fairly consistent media market and some sectors and age. Or the next slide. Yeah. So again, fairly consistent there. Next slide. Tax issue comparison. Do you want to increase or decrease sales, personal, or property? Again, fairly consistent. Property, certainly the highest by far of wanting to decrease, but nobody wants to. Very few people, business CEOs, want to increase any of those. Next slide. Just another way to look at this. Again, I'm going to roll through these unless you stop because it's just a different way of looking at the same data. Next slide. It's interesting. This is a note from Repulsor. A little unusual that those in the capital city are most interested in cutting taxes. We also see a correlation with the desire to cut sales tax and the number of employees the company has. Next one, which is certainly relevant to the conference committee today and some of the issues you all be facing, to change the personal income tax. 51% say decrease, 3% say increase. Next slide. Yeah, so that's just another way to slice that data. Change property tax. Next one. Very similar numbers to the, more folks want to change or want to decrease the property tax, but the gap between those who increase and decrease fairly similar. Next slide again is the data just sliced up in a couple different ways. Next two slides, this hasn't been a serious conversation in a long time, but issuing a sales tax on professional services. These are business CEOs, again, whether they may not be in a professional service business, but let's just call it pretty unpopular to institute a sales tax on professional services. You can slide through that one too. Would it help the Kansas economy to lower taxes? 74% of the respondents said yes, only 22% said no. So that has actually been a fairly significant move over the last 4 years if you look at the data from 2020 to 2023. Next slide. More rural areas tend to be more supportive of tax cuts, while we see some reluctance in the Kansas City and the Northeast. Next slide, again, a different way to look at the data. Those in ag with fewer than 10 employees and thinking things are going in the wrong direction are the most supportive of cutting taxes as an economic growth strategy. Back to workforce, satisfaction with workforce. It's crossed into majority unsatisfactory, and we'll get into some slides of why that is. But that's a fairly significant change. It really started changing the year after COVID, if I have my dates right, or was 2021 the first year of COVID? So I've already forgotten. But that's a significant change that we're going to look into a little bit more, hopefully with some more polling. I mean, the change is stark enough that there has to be something going on in what the business CEOs are thinking. So next slide is you look at the media markets. And then also optimistic or pessimistic, meaning if you're pessimistic, you're probably unsatisfactory. You might be pessimistic about a lot of things. Next slide, why not rate the workforce higher? So the willingness to work is a majority for the first time this year. It's always been one of the key areas. Worker quality remains a top concern. Next slide. So here is the word cloud on this topic of what those respondents said and open-ended of why they're not satisfied. So next slide, what is the greatest concern, which is somewhat a different way to ask the two slides before. Soft skills remains the number one of the greatest concern. And then you have technical skills and employees with degrees and passing drug tests. Those continue to go down. Now, what we don't do is ask or define soft skills. Anecdotally, when I talk to my members, it's communication, being analytical, team building, showing up on time, those things. Now, it may be something broader than that, but that's something else we're going to dig into a little bit more. Next slide, just another way to look at the data of what the concerns are, but it is soft skills. Next slide, satisfaction with the public school system. Relatively consistent on the satisfactory, but the unsatisfactory has certainly ticked up in the last 4 years. So next slide. And another way to look at the data, and then the next slide, what's the most important thing for improving education? It somewhat answers the question, why are folks unsatisfied? But we certainly could dig into that a little bit more. It's improving performance rather than increasing funding. And over the last 7, 8 years, that's certainly a significant decrease in the numbers who think, of respondents who think more funding is most important for education, from 39% to 29%. Most important for funding education, again, just a different way to look at the data in the media markets or geographic areas. So again, a little consistency with Kansas City being a little bit of an outlier compared to the rest of the state. However, it's still a majority improving performance rather than more funding. Now, this next slide, I didn't know whether to include. I didn't know if it's going to hurt anybody's feelings, but I thought it might be of interest. It's a relationship with your legislator, and you don't have a whole lot or very close. Some first name basis, comfortable. So I guess if you look at the top three, you're getting into close to 50. And again, these are business CEOs and business executives. So I thought you might find that interesting, that data interesting. The next one, I don't know, I'm already regretting including this, but there it is. It's not our data, it's the respondents, the state legislature job performance. Quarter of business leaders give the legislature a poor rating, the highest since 2017. Next slide, just divvied up by our sectors and then also media market. Next question, another big change in the last 2 years, just asking the statement, Kansas has the best business climate in America. 65% disagree. That is the second highest since 2015, and only 21% agree, and that is the lowest since, I believe, since we started it. Obviously, we can't go all the way back on the slide. It gets too busy if we go back to 2005, 2006. Next slide is business sector and media market and number of employees. So pretty heavy disagree. It's a little disappointing. Only a few are asleep. So I'm happy to answer questions. I got a few more things. And I know I went through this pretty fast, but I'm sure with Lance's help, scroll back and look at them, or you can look at the data in detail. But again, lots of consistency over the last 10 years with some changes, really COVID on the workforce and quality and dissatisfaction with it.
Okay, hello. We'll go ahead and open it for questions. Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So on page 33 is the why not rate workforce higher. So it looks like that no workers has pretty well left. I mean, as far as from 22 to 23, that has gone away. So evidently businesses are getting the workers they need. They're just dissatisfied with the workers they're getting.
That would be my interpretation. And again, there's always a lag in the federal and state data. So these are questions that were asked in December. So I'll be interested to look at the job growth, job openings versus unemployment. Again, this is 300 business CEOs that, although it's pretty diverse, so that certainly is a fairly significant change. And I would guess some of the 2020 number is the extended unemployment. That was the point of view of the business CEOs. That's probably it, but without asking that specific question, not sure. Thank you.
Representative Blue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Alan, I have two questions real quick. The first one, and I'm mostly looking at the last slide, slide 45, over best business climate. And obviously in my area, ag is a huge area, a huge employer. And so my question is, what is your membership with farmers and ranchers, or is your membership mostly with like the dealerships and seed sales and so forth?
It's going to be the agribusinesses
Okay.
that are members. Like, I doubt that we have very many like solo entrepreneurs. We have members that have 2, 3, 4, 5 employees, but we do have agribusiness, but I'd call it agribusiness rather than the producers.
Right. Okay. I was curious on that. And the second question I have is property taxes. Chamber, do you guys have a stance on if it's a local or state issue?
On the which, I'm sorry?
On property taxes?
Yeah,
Is it
they're
local
too high.
What?
They're too high. Did you have a specific bill?
No, I'm just curious. I agree with you that they're too high, but I'm curious who should solve it? Your county commissioners with your mill levy, or is it the state legislature?
Well, I think it's more of a local government. They're the ones who drive it. There's the 21 mills at the state level and the mill and a half for capital cost. But it's got to be the local government. I know can be challenging or difficult, but they're the ones levying the property taxes. So I know there's the issue of the LAVTR and the 100,000 exemption, et cetera. So there are things you can do, but ultimately to solve it, if anything gets solved, it's got to be the leadership, elected leaders at the local level. That'd be my opinion.
Thank you. That's what I was looking for.
Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks for having us back. Alan, thank you for being here today.
Sure.
Of what should probably come as no surprise. Well, first things first, I do want to say that if anyone has any issues with their legislators, you just send them my number. I'm more than happy to improve relationships. But also, I want to call our attention to, I think, slide 36 here. So one of the conversations that we often have here, whether it's about the disconnect between business and education. And so I know that we all have really pushed sort of an emphasis on technical skills, especially regarding STEM. And then there's been kind of a pushback when it comes to teaching what we would call soft skills in school. Honestly, and I think that you and I might agree because we've had excellent dialogue on this, and I'm grateful to you for that. I would like us to see moving more towards executive functioning as a real definition of that, because that, of course, involves critical skills, the ability to get along with people who are different than you are, as well as the standard things of showing up to work on time, knowing how to do some of that basic functioning. But what I'm curious about is, has the chamber ever had any kind of focus groups where they talk about what are soft skills? What is executive functioning? What do you mean by that? And how we can help with that more when it comes to policy?
We haven't, and we need to. And I'm about to go to a state, a conference with other state chamber CEOs, and I'm going to ask our states, or is there state in a particular state doing well on the soft skills? And I know there's controversy in the K-12 funding about social and emotional learning. I don't know everything about that. To me, that is not what these CEOs are talking about. And it is a little bit of a disconnect when you hear anecdotally that it's the technical skills, whether it's 2-year degree, 4 years degree, but that's not what the data says. So I'm not sure how to reconcile that. It's like a lot of things the public asks you to do all of the above, and that's not always easy.
Yeah, exactly. But
well, and I do think a lot of employers look at it as, let's get someone with some basic skills, integrity, we can train them. And I think that's from almost GED, probably can't train a PhD, but I think at all levels, not just technical, but skills to be a good sales manager, skills to be an analyst, et cetera.
Yeah, like the so-called people skills.
Yeah.
So, well, I know that we've always worked really well together here in this chamber, especially on this committee. So anything that we can see on that would be amazing. And thank you.
Absolutely. I had a couple of more slides that are a little bit of stream of consciousness, unless there's still more questions on the poll, which I'm happy to answer.
We do have a question on your poll.
Sure.
Representative Dotson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This looks to me like a business climate survey. And so my question is, as opposed to data, when we look at particularly the slides that indicate a 10% change from 2022 to 2023, is this backed up by data like retail sales growth or export growth or a number of people
Well, some
hired?
of those changes were kind of, I guess I'd call it attitudinal, where this is what the business CEO thought. And again, when you look at particularly that they're not hiring or are hiring, we'll have a better idea how accurate that is in a quarter, 6 months, or 9 months as the data comes in, which is somewhat relevant. I wanted to go to the last couple slides. The next one, keep scrolling. That's the pollster. Many of you know him. He's done a lot of opinion polling. He is the person who's done the chamber CEO poll for 19 years. So next slide. One thing.
Welcome, Representative Sutton. I'm glad you could join us.
Next slide. So one thing that we have looked at for a while is the one way to measure states. These are kind of the basic ways to measure state economic growth. You look at GDP, income, population, which is migration in and out, and the number of private sector jobs. And Kansas usually bumps along, 23 to 35, and sometimes 40, sometimes 22. I know in the third quarter of last year, I think Kansas was in the top 2 or 3 in GDP growth, which is great. Although I tend to take a longer term view. I wouldn't be depressed if we were 50th in one quarter. You have to look at over 2, 3, 4 quarters, or maybe even a couple of years. But those are things to look at. And then the next slide, other things, which I think gets to your question on business climate. So you have experts that look at a lot of this different data and come up with their best states to do business. And so here are some of the ones that we look at, and some of them are business about business startups. Some are just the best states to do business. Kansas usually 24, 25, 26. I think a reasonable goal to be getting the top third. And again, these are a little bit subjective. And they use objective data, in my view, to come up with somewhat of a subjective ranking. But these are all of those are worth taking a look at as far as ways to rank either economy, or I think the Tax Foundation does a great job of looking at the structure of a state's the structure of how states raise taxes. And there's a business climate. There's an overall, and after the GILTI, all the federal tax, the governor's veto was overridden, I think we jumped 10 spots in the Tax Foundation, but we've already dropped down 2 or 3 because other states are moving faster and can continue to do things. I know this is not the tax committee, but I had to throw in the last slide. I think Eric will be proud of me. So those are the 0 or flat income tax states or single rate. And the day you can see it on your computer, not up there, but there's a lot of states that if they don't have it, they're moving towards it. Or there are red and blue state or blue and purple states that already have it: Pennsylvania, Illinois, Colorado. So it's not, not some kind of crazy idea. A lot of states have had it for a while, but that's where you get. How do we better compete with our neighboring states and our competitive states, whether they're neighbors or not? And tax policy is one. So is workforce. So are some other things. But I just wanted to throw that up there. I'm happy to answer more questions.
Yeah, just to follow on, one of the things I worry about on the attitude stuff, if you watched for the past maybe over a year and a half, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, other professional papers indicated that we were going to have a hard landing, for example. And they also indicated various outcomes for China's economy. So you have to be a little careful, I think, about the attitudes, because people tend to take that attitude when they're not supported by the economic facts on the ground.
Sure.
And one of your slides, for example, in 2022 said that the biggest worry on personnel was staffing, In other words, the numbers. And then in 2023, it said quality. I was a little surprised by that. And I had also kind of as a follow-on, I'd listened to your presentation when you rolled out the Chamber's 5 priorities. And one of the things we had talked about in here and other committees was childcare, and I didn't hear that. And I think some people believe that one of the fastest way to return workers into the workforce is to have a credible childcare program. So I'd like to get your views on that.
Sure, we didn't, and maybe this is something we can add. We've tried to keep the questions consistent, so you see over time. So we did not ask a childcare question. That is something we certainly could do moving forward. I do think it's an important part of workforce, and we have supported a variety of policy items. What I don't know, and again, when I was looking at this in December, is if the workforce is not increasing, do they feel like or they feel like they're not going to be adding jobs? How important is childcare? I mean, we all know it is important, and I applaud the legislature for taking a look at it, whether it's the tax credits or what the governor's office did with easing some of the regulatory burden. But good question. I don't have a lot for you, but that's something we can look into more. One slide that I will forward to Chairman Tarwater, and this, I think this addresses a little bit of what you said. We have an economist, Ted Abernathy, that's done some things for us. So you look at the various rankings, CNBC, Forbes, and then you look at the actual economic performance and see how consistent it is. And sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. I believe most of them had Kansas relatively, the actual economic performance close to where the rankings are. But it is an interesting slide. You got to spend a few minutes looking at all these dots. But I will get that to the chairman. So I think this committee would be interested in that.
Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Thanks, Mr.
Sure.
Chair.
I have one question on this. The public school system, the businesses are not happy with what with the product that we're creating. That's not just K through 12, right? That's all institutions.
I would guess it's K-12. That is something. Eric, do you know? I think the satisfaction of public schools is just K-12. I don't think it is higher ed. And although that's something, again, we should probably be looking at in future surveys, is tech college, community college certificates, et cetera. And I'm looking for those slides. Yeah, so when it says public school system, I'm sure that is the K-12, not higher ed.
Okay, and just so I heard you right, this committee has heard over and over that there's workforce development issues as far as manpower, number of jobs, number of employees, and it seems like the demand for workforce is decreasing. And is that because we don't have the right workforce, or the automating, or what
No,
can
no.
we?
That's one of the challenges with a poll is you can't you have the poll set out, and you can't ask a follow-up question. We need to add it to the next surveys. And again, this is just one. This is a snapshot in time, so that it may be different when we do the poll next November and December. But something we're going to be looking into. Again, anecdotally, and some other global data, folks are still looking for qualified workforces, and it does depend on obviously the company and what their product or service is, and how they've been able to fill their open jobs.
Any other questions? Seeing none. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Feel free to catch Eric in the hall and ask him anything if you have follow-up questions.
All right, next up, legislative post audit. Josh Luthi. Welcome to Commerce Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I am Josh Luthi with Legislative Post Audit, here to talk to you about new economic development incentive programs created in 2022. You should all have a memo available to you with a subject line evaluating new economic development incentive programs created in 2022. That's what I'm going to be speaking off of. So state law requires us to evaluate all incentive programs the year after they're created. So that's what this memo is about. In 2022, there were 11 new programs. However, today I'm really only going to be focusing on 4 of those programs because when you evaluate a program the year after it's created, there's usually not a lot to look at, let alone evaluate. So if you go through the memo, you'll see for a lot of these, there's either no or very limited data to report. So what I'd like to do here today is focus on the 4 programs where we identified issues that we thought you all might want to consider this session. That said, if you have questions about any of the programs, I would be happy to field those at the appropriate time. So the program I want to start out with is the Attracting Powerful Economic Expansion, or APEX program. Information about this one starts on the first page. The APEX program, we're probably all relatively familiar with it, but this is the program that allows Commerce to once per year enter into a relatively large incentive agreement with a business that agrees to invest at least $1 billion in a Kansas facility. One of these is the Panasonic agreement. That might be the one that you all are most familiar with. State law allowed Commerce to enter into one agreement per year for 2 years, and it's done that, so there aren't going to be any more of these. In terms of economic and fiscal impacts, like I said, there have been 2 agreements so far. Those agreements are with Panasonic and Integra. Both of these projects are still in their early stages, so like I said earlier, there's really not a lot for us to report on or evaluate. With regard to the Panasonic project, Panasonic is opening a battery manufacturing facility in DeSoto. They're supposed to open that facility by November 2027 and invest $1 billion by then. While the agreement doesn't agree Panasonic to create or retain a certain number of jobs, Panasonic does anticipate investing about $4 billion and creating about 4,000 full-time jobs. In exchange for that, Panasonic got a 12.5% refundable tax credit and a variety of other incentives, including things like relocation reimbursements and payroll assistance. Panasonic hasn't started leveraging any of those incentives except for one, though. Panasonic has started using its sales tax exemption, and that's one of the issues that we wanted to highlight for you all. Right now, or at the time we talked to them rather, neither Commerce nor Revenue had a way to track how much sales tax Apex businesses have been exempted from. Commerce officials told us they were working on developing a system to do that, and we think that's important so that either Commerce or individuals like ourselves can report to you all how much these businesses have benefited from this incentive. That information would also be very important if a business violated this agreement and was asked to repay incentives. We need to know how much they got so we know how much they need to repay. The second agreement was with Integra, and they are supposed to open a semiconductor manufacturing facility in Wichita. However, that project hasn't started in any capacity because the project was contingent on Integra getting funding under the federal Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors, or CHIPS Act. And last we talked to Commerce, that was still up in the air, so this project may or may not materialize. So those are my comments on Apex. The next program I want to talk about is the Attracting Professional Sports to Kansas Fund. This content is on page 4. In 2022, you all created a fund called the Attracting Professional Sports to Kansas Fund that Commerce is allowed to use to basically benefit professional sports teams in Kansas. This fund gets funded by sports wagering revenues annually. As of September 2023, the fund had about $4.1 million in it. Commerce officials told us they were looking at several ways in which they could use this money and said they were basically going to hold the money in the fund until they determined whether they were going to have a way to use it. And that's going to bring me to the issue that we all wanted to identify for you all. And that is, we think the statutory language regarding how this fund should have money transferred into and out of it is confusing. So statute says that funding should be placed in the sports fund annually, but then it requires Commerce to report on and return quote unquote excess funding monthly. It's not clear what this excess funding means though. So one interpretation could mean that Commerce has 1 month to find a way to use the money. If they can't find a way, then they have to return it. But another interpretation could mean Commerce could hold on to the money in the fund basically indefinitely because they're always considering a way to use it. It's not clear what you all intended, so we're raising it for your consideration in case you want to clarify the sort of timeline on which Commerce should be holding money in the fund. third program I want to talk about is also on page 4, and then it goes on to pages 5 and 6, I think, and that's the Affordable Housing Tax Credit. This is the most complicated one I'm going to talk about today, and hopefully I do a good job, so bear with me. But what this is a tax credit to match the federal low-income housing, or LIHTC. It works very similar to the federal tax credit in that it is literally a dollar for dollar match. So I'm going to talk mainly about the federal tax credit and then kind of use that to explain the state one. Kansas Housing Resources Corporation administers both of these tax credits. So when KHRC allocates $1 of federal state tax credit to a developer, it's also supposed to allocate $1 of state tax credit. And then developers go on and they use these tax credits to award them to investors in exchange for investment in their housing projects. And with that investment, they are able to produce more affordable rental housing. What makes this tax credit a little difficult to explain, in my opinion, is it's not just a single year tax credit. If I am a developer and I get, let's say, $100,000 of tax credit from KHRC, and I give that $100,000 tax credit to an investor, they get to claim that $100,000 in not just 1 year, but 10 years for a total of $1 million. And that's going to bring me to the issue we wanted you all to consider. In 2023, KHRC awarded $25.1 million in Kansas affordable housing tax credits to 24 housing projects. Because those tax credits can be redeemed annually for 10 years, the total cost of this tax credit could be as much as $251 million in foregone revenues. KHRC will allocate these credits annually, and every year they do so, it's going to create another 10-year stream of tax credits. So if KHRC allocates about $25 million worth of credits every year, that cost is going to basically ramp up over time until the annual foregone revenues are potentially as high as $250 million a year. So we did want to raise that for y'all's consideration in case you all wanted to place an annual cap on the state tax credit, because when we were looking at what other states do, we did notice many cap their annual state tax credits. For example, Oklahoma caps its annual state tax credit at $4 million per year. The final program I plan to talk about here today is on page 8. It is the Commercial Restoration and Preservation Tax Credit. And this allows entities that basically renovate or restore a commercial structure to claim a tax credit related to their expenses to do so. So from that perspective, I think it's fairly straightforward, but the issue we wanted to raise for you all was that statute doesn't define what commercial structure means. So it's unclear what buildings might qualify for this credit, which means KDOR is basically using their discretion to decide what projects qualify. This kind of came up to us when we were looking at other states because states define commercial structures differently. So for example, some states include things like rental properties as income producing structures, and we're not sure if the legislature intended for properties like that to qualify for this credit. So those were the 4 programs I wanted to comment on here today. I would be happy to stand for questions at this time.
Representative Shu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you so much. Just off the top of your head, do you know roughly how much money it takes to attract a sports team, or how much money is giving it in incentives to keep a sports team in an area?
I don't believe I have any numbers readily available to me. I know we did look at some, just like basically news articles about this, and typically what sports teams seem to be interested in are new facilities or facility renovations, and those can be tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars.
Yeah, off the top of my head, I think the Titans got $500 million from the state, and like $700 million from Nashville. I think Buffalo got about $330 million. So it seems like we're probably pretty far away from luring a team to Kansas with the $4.1 million that we have. So I'd be open to re-examining this particular fund. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So I'd ask you to think along the lines of rollerball. I think we can get a rollerball team here. No, no, really that fund though, if I recall right, was I think it comes with bonding authority, and so we could bond future revenues to get to where we needed to do possibly. And I'm not as concerned about that fund as other people. It's good to have it there. So there are professional sport teams know that we're serious about this and we do have funds, but should we ever need those funds, just like any other pot of money we have around here, we can always sweep them and take them. So it's just kind of like a savings account for now that says, hey, yeah, we'd like to entertain a new sports team if you're willing to come here. And as long as it's there, it creates at least a conversation and it's fun to talk about. Representative Laura Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a clarification. I don't know if you'd be the best person. I was not here whenever we created that sports fund and passed that bill. Was the funding of that bill, and I could be wrong, and from what I'm recalling, those businesses that are in sports betting got to use marketing funds for that so that they weren't pouring in the full amount to that sports fund? And then how is that true?
I am not familiar with the details of how the gambling management deals with that. I just know that the money in this fund comes from sports wagering revenues. How that gets cut up, I do not know.
Okay, I didn't know how exactly that shaped out into the full revenue funds that were going in. And if there was marketing costs that were taken into account, and I didn't know if there was a period of time, then that would sunset or expire on those sports betting companies.
We can have research get that answered for you. But it's my understanding that it's just a portion of the state's take on sports wagering, and it goes into a fund that we could use eventually to attract a sports team. But I'm not quite sure about the marketing and all that.
Okay. The only reason why I was asking to see if there'd be an increase of funds where that fund would be a more substantial amount than what we're talking about right now. That's all I was asking for clarification. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Dodson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. On the sports betting, I don't know what was in your charter on the audit on this, but did we do any comparison about the performance of what we're doing here in Kansas versus some other programs in other states? The reason I ask is when we were debating this, it was management by someone else versus management of our existing gambling organizations here in the state. And the argument was made that we get a far greater return if we just placed it in the hands of those who are already managing. So that's the point of my question.
So we didn't look broadly at what other states do with their wagering revenues, but we did look to see if other states have programs similar to Kansas's Attracting Professional Sports Fund. And we found only one other state, Florida, has a similar program. That said, there are a variety of states. We identified at least 14 that have, in various forms and fashions, offered public funding for professional sports facilities.
Okay, thanks. I've got a quick follow-on if I can on the housing tax credit. When you're talking about the 10 years and maybe we would like to do something with an annual cap, can you go through that short explanation you gave again about how that piles up?
Yes. So with this state tax credit, and it's also true for the federal thing, they work virtually identically as I understand it, is KHRC gives a housing developer an allocation of tax credits. The developer then passes that credit on to investors in exchange for investment. They use the investment to build the housing project at lower costs so they can offer lower, more affordable rents. The investor then, once the housing project is complete and there are people living in it, they get to start claiming their tax credit. And they get to claim that tax credit every year for 10 years. So if I'm an investor who got a $100,000 tax credit, I get to claim that tax credit every year for 10 years for a total of $1 million. KHRC allocates these tax credits every year, and each year it creates a new stream of 10-year tax credits. So even though maybe, using easier numbers here, there's $1 million out there in year one. By the time we get to year two, there's a total of $2 million and then $3 million, so on and so forth, until every year individuals are potentially claiming millions of dollars in tax credits. Does that make sense?
I completely misunderstood that when I read the bill, I guess, because my interpretation was that if, let's say, you had a $250,000 investment that you wanted to pass on for 10 years, you could take a tenth of that over 10 years, not that you got it every year for 10 years. So I was confused. I don't think I ever would have supported it the way it's written.
I think it was news to a lot of people. Yes.
Yeah, thank you.
And how much did we give out last year? Did you
In
say?
2023, KRC awarded $25.1 million in tax credits.
And that adds up to 250 million then total.
Over 10 years, yes.
Does it work the same with the federal program as it does with the state?
Yeah, the state tax credit is a match to the federal tax credit. So right now, the only cap on the state tax credit is the federal cap on the federal credit, which is, I think, somewhat more than 25 million. Mr. Chair, I believe someone from Housing Resources is here if you happen to have questions for them.
So did we give out a total of $500 million in credit, including the federal, or is that combined?
It's for each.
So a total of 500 million?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is not the tax committee, so I'm not really specifically asking this question, but I'm looking at all the tax credits that were reviewed in this audit and wondering how many credits we give away annually. But I do find it interesting that the teacher's purchase of school and classroom tax supplies tax credit is limited to $250 per taxpayer per year. And yet we just heard about a potential 250 million or 50 million going out the door. And I think our legislature needs to do a better job of parity and making sure that we know where the money's going. And I know that that's something that maybe Commerce can take a good look at this year. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thanks for coming. And I would point out to the committee that this review is in statute and they have to do it every single year, and it usually doesn't yield too much. And so that'll tie into the bill that we're going to be hearing on Thursday that attempts to get rid of most of the statutorial audits, so it frees up post-audit to target more audits that we would choose. And doesn't mean we can't choose Commerce items to target. It's just that we can target it in our own way and free up time to do more audits that matter to the legislature. So we'll talk about that Thursday. Josh, thanks for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so typically when we hear an audit and post-audit, anybody that's being audited has the right to come and tell us their side. And so I figured that Ryan Vincent from the Kansas Housing Resource Corporation reached out to me early this morning or late last week, actually, and I told him he was welcome to come, say his side, because we figured that housing credit was going to cause some questions. And so, Ryan, thanks for being here today, and can't wait to hear your side of things. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Is this on? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's good to be back. I'm now at 20 years at Kansas Housing. I was thinking of how many years I've been coming to this state house, having conversations with policymakers, hearing about the need for more affordable housing. It goes back to Alan's presentation, how we've got to have homes for us to be able to have job expansion, healthy neighborhoods, good schools, everything so interconnected. That's why we were so pleased to finally have real resources to be able to address the underlying, not just housing crisis, but housing supply problem we've had in our state for years. I do want to make sure I do a shout out to our friends at LPA. They are the consummate professionals. They do an excellent job. They make sure that they hear us out, and I've very much appreciated working with them. But I do want to make sure that the committee and the legislature understands the full picture about this tax credit we're talking about. I mentioned 20 years now I've been doing this business. This program, however, has been around for 40 years. It started with President Reagan and a bipartisan Congress during the tax reform age back in 1986. The idea was that it's a private-public partnership. Not only is it the government making sure that the developments are built well, that they serve the people they're intended to serve, but it's the private sector because it's tax credits, which go back to the economic development that you heard about today. We just finished up a statewide housing study, our first statewide housing study in 30 years that was completed and presented to you all in 2022. I think I ended up presenting to 10 plus legislative hearings that year. We ended up getting an affordable housing tax credit that we're talking about today. We got a Kansas Housing Investor Tax Credit, and then we got resources for moderate income housing, recognizing that there's a big group of people that make too much to qualify for low income housing programs. But there are teachers, there are nurses, there are people that can't buy a home, there are people that can't build a home because of the economic situation that we have in our state and in our nation. Specifically about the affordable housing tax credit, this year alone, because we finally had this dollar for dollar state tax credit, KHRC, through our partners across the state, have been able to fund 2,200 new homes. There's a spreadsheet in your digital packet that actually talks about how many units the communities. I'll tell you, most of these communities have not had affordable housing built in them in years. But because of this resource, specifically in rural communities, we're able to get this housing on the ground. Moreover, this credit, even though it was passed and allocated for the first time last year, will not actually be claimed until 2027. I'll repeat that. That's 2027, 3 years from the time that the housing is getting built, meaning that for 3 years, the state of Kansas is getting over $540 million in development built at zero cost to the state. Now, turning to other resources that have come with this dollar for dollar state housing tax credit, you may have heard the private activity bond. It's something that has been this resource that's available at the federal level that the state of Kansas has never been able to utilize. As an example, in 2022, before we had this new tax credit, we were able to finance one $5 million development to develop multifamily housing in the state. Because of this new state dollar for dollar affordable housing tax credit, in 1 year alone, we were able to finance 12 developments in your districts, totaling over $250 million. That's $250 million in federal resources that we're using that we weren't able to use just a year ago. Now, specifically, let's talk about the $250 million fiscal costs that you heard about. Again, just a reminder that that's going to take 10 years before it truly hits that $250 million cost to the state. Not only will we have no cost to the state the first 3 years because of the timing of the development, but since the credit is actually claimed over 10 years, and if we're able to do 2,200 homes per year, that means that over 10 years, we will be building or financing 22,000 homes in rural and urban communities across our state that serve low-income individuals, people that work, that need a quality, affordable home to be able to call their own, for their employers to be able to expand. Beyond that, there's additional economic impact for the state. There's employment. That comes, of course, when you're talking about construction jobs, or more long-term, when you're talking about employers with the ability to expand. There's labor income, there's payroll taxes, there's property taxes that each one of these developments pay to your local communities, as well as to our state government. There's economic impact. An identical University of Georgia study on an identical tax credit in Georgia found that for every $1 of state income tax lost to the tax credit, an additional $5.79 in economic activity was created. That's an almost 6-to-1 return just on the economic impact of their state affordable housing tax credit. Similarly, you heard about the Oklahoma housing study. Just weeks ago, they released a report saying that for their $36 million in state tax credits over 8 years, it resulted in $709 million in construction activity, $1.75 billion with a B in economic activity. Years ago, when I was here at the State House, I kept hearing about how we can't get developers. We can't get them in rural communities. We can't get them in suburban communities. We need to attract developers. Because of this new resource, we're attracting developers from out of state. We're developing more homegrown investors. We've approved deals in areas with high economic growth, from Dodge City with the Hilmer plant to Salina, from Wichita to the DeSoto area, the Panasonic project that you just heard about. Lastly, just a reminder that you, of course, are the policymakers and we are the program administrators. We were very upfront about the cost of the program from the get-go, but we also recognize that you, as your stewardship, have to really account for the fiscal cost. We do have data showing all of the different stuff that I've talked about today, but we also recognize the importance of providing this information. So one of the things that we're doing is we're actually working to get with the Office of Rural Prosperity to get an economic impact study specifically about the new state housing development resources that were funded last session. So we've made amazing progress in rolling out the investments that you all have made. Like any investments, they take time to mature. It takes time to get the dividends from an investment, and we're very happy to provide that information to make sure that you know about the housing being built through these programs in your communities. And at this point, I'm happy to field any questions. Thank you.
Committee, any questions? Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much for your presentation today, and thank you for the good information that you gave us. You said that you've been with the group for over 20, and this started about 40 years ago. In your understanding, is there any envisioning that they had of helping to build with any childcare facilities with any of these structures?
That's actually a question, Representative. It's not actually allowed under the federal rules or the state rules to be able to use it for childcare facilities. That said, it's amazing how codependent all of these different issues are. When we're able to finance quality housing, we're able to make sure that people have a quality place to recharge, to go home so that their jobs can expand their employment, but also so that people can utilize childcare facilities so that they can go to good schools. These things are so interconnected. We saw that during the pandemic. We administered over $350 million in foreclosure assistance and eviction prevention. We know that housing stability is key to so many different areas. And I know a hot topic has been what to do with so many people experiencing homelessness right now. That's a big discussion at the State House. The biggest issue leading to homelessness in our state is a lack of affordable housing supply. This resource is the biggest solution. This is the biggest headway we've made in addressing our housing supply across the state and in some of the most difficult to serve communities. So we're grateful for the resource. And I'll tell you, we've never been able to build 2,200 affordable homes through one program in 1 year in our state.
So these 2,200 homes that we're building, do we own them?
No, Mr. Chairman. So the homes are actually owned by private developers through their LLCs. And just a little bit more detail on the process. So we allocate the credit through a highly competitive process. The developers sell the credits to banks. They sell the tax credits to insurance companies. They sell them to investors. So again, going back to that public-private partnership, these are privately owned housing developments. They're regulated through the program. They commit to remain affordable for a 30-plus year period. They commit to serve persons between 30 and 80% of area median income. So just as an example, household of four, that's generally, less than $40,000 a year. We all know how hard it is to pay, just keep up with general life expense. And when you're talking a household of four that makes below $40,000 a year, these are working households, but they need some assistance. But because they've got stable housing, they can then go and work those jobs that we so need them for our communities to be successful. Did that answer your question, Chair?
Yeah, the private, we don't own any of the houses.
That's correct.
So if you give out $25 million a year, each year, in 10 years, the state's piece of it is $2.5 billion a year, right?
So we have a total based on, and that's the challenge with this, is that we only have 1 year of history so far. But based on the amount of credit authority we had this year, we were able to award a total of $25 million in annual credit, both state and then federal. For the state part, which you all are interested, of course, that is a 10-year credit. So over 10 years, that equates to $250 million. But again, that goes back to all those economic impact data then that I talked about with the study and all the resources it allows us to leverage.
Right. This year is $250 million after 10 years.
That's correct.
Each year, if you do another 25 million, we're going to be up to 2.5 billion each year that it stays in that it goes on into perpetuity?
Well, it'll be $250 million per year once we hit the full 10-year and then thereafter, assuming that the credit doesn't change.
Okay.
And I might just reiterate then that just in 1 year, we were able to leverage $500 million in development, other outsized dollars to be able to get this housing built. So, it is an investment, but it has major dividends on numerous fronts.
All right. And then what is the investor's portion? How much is there a maximum percentage of the project that we can pay, or we're talking about $500 million here? So what was their investment?
So the investors, what they will do is they'll actually, through a syndicator, they'll purchase the credit for a set price. And that generally will range, depending on the federal credit, generally will range between 88 cents and mid 90s on the dollar. Now the state credits historically go a lot lower. That's we're seeing probably 65 cents on the dollar. And there's a number of reasons for that. Some of it is just the time value of money. If you pay money up front, then you're going to expect some return over a 10-year period if you can't claim that credit, especially if there's 3 years initially when you're out of pocket without any return. So that's what the investor is ultimately getting. But a reminder that these investors are our bankers. There are insurance companies. There are individuals looking for tax savings within our state.
Okay, so that wasn't my question, but that leads me to something else that I'll ask you here in a minute. But my question was, how much is so if the state's paying $500 million for these 22,000 houses, the state and the feds, how much is the actual person that builds the house, how much are they putting in of their own investment dollars in order to get the $500 million?
Thank you. I'm tracking better now. So that depends, and it depends specifically on what the project is, whether it's a rural community, urban community. What the developer does is they compile a lot of different sources of funds because it takes multiple layers of financing. It may take our tax credits. It may take funds from the Federal Home Loan Bank. It will take private funds from banks, that they'll pay permanent debt on. Ultimately, our credits end up paying about 70% of the cost to build the housing. And the reason for that is that for 30 years, those properties are going to be charging well below market rate. So just to make the costs and the pro forma work out over 30 years, it takes that much different sources, which is why currently, without any state or federal assistance, there's no affordable housing being built in your communities.
And these are all for rent, not sale.
That's correct.
What's the contract look like how do you track that they're actually renting to people that make a certain dollars? And once they make, say, if you are making $40,000 and then they start making $100,000, do we kick them out of the apartment? Do they have to stay poor to live there, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Lots of good questions there. Compliance is never fun, but it's a big part of what we do. And the beauty of this program is it's the one program that's not just us making sure that the right people are in the homes, that is being well maintained, that all the conditions from the federal and state are being followed. Not only do we have a qualified allocation plan to award the funds, we then sign legal documents with the developer. We have restrictive use covenants so that ultimately if they get out of compliance, we can take legal action to enforce our covenants. We go out and we do annually required monitoring through our housing compliance division. But not only do we do that, but the investors, what they call syndicators, do that, because ultimately, if the property gets out of compliance, then those banks, those insurance companies that have the tax credits end up having to repay the funds. So they've got real money on the line, which is why this program has been so successful that all 6 of our federal congressional delegation have been on record supporting the program.
So what's the contract look like as far as rent? You can only charge 30% of the market rate since we paid 70% to build them?
So the rents are actually subject to they use HUD's rent standards, but they've got to keep them below a published rent schedule for each year that's put out by HUD. And again, it's limited to people that are 80% or lower of area median income.
Committee, any of you all have questions? I'm sorry. I'm just really interested in how this all works.
It's a lot of complexity, and I certainly understand just the, happy to provide this information. So.
Representative Carpenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if we extrapolate that out over the next 10 years with this tax credit, we would have 22,000 homes?
That's correct, assuming that we keep the same production and the same ability to award the credits.
On 25 million a year.
That's correct.
We would have 22,000 homes.
And not only are they homes, but they're affordable homes for 30 years for some of our most vulnerable citizens.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's actually 250 million a year, because for the 25 million that we just committed for the homes that are being built right now, that adds up after 10 years to 250 million. And then you add the federals in, it's 500 million. How many houses did $500 million buy us?
So the 2,200 was actually just the state credit funded housing. So you could essentially double that with the federal resource.
And then just to respond, it's also not 100% tax credit. So it's what, 65, 70%?
That's correct, sir. So we actually, a lot of our units are actually mixed income developments. So it's a way to be able to finance some market rate or even moderate income housing, along with some more affordable low income housing at one development.
So when we say that, we're not really saying in dollars, we're saying a percentage of dollars. Is that it's costing us?
I believe so. I think I understand your question, but
it's a 70 cents on the dollar tax credit.
So depending on the pricing, and the pricing of the credit is what the market kind of creates for the credit at any given time based on tax rates, based on economic conditions. But historically, we've seen it, I mean, in the 1 year of the program, kind of in that range.
What range was that?
65, 70 cents, I believe.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we're paying 70% of the project. Then with our tax credits, then our tax credits are sold to someone else, and the people that are building the house get 65 to 70 cents on the dollar for their tax credit.
That's correct.
So why not just make it a refundable tax credit? The state's on the hook for 100% of it, not 65. The end user that buys it will cash that in. So why not just make it refundable and allow them to bond it, and we can build even more houses?
You know, that's certainly, and that's where you as policymakers come in. Honestly, I'd prefer the dollar. You know, if something's going to be sold for 65 cents on the dollar, that I, as the housing administrator for the state, would rather have the dollar. But there's a lot of value that comes with the tax credits, not just the ability to help our banks and our insurance companies, but also the ability to have that public-private partnership, that oversight of the property to make sure it's well built. So, you know, that's where we really defer to you all as the body that makes the program rules. Whatever resources we have, we're grateful for, we will put to good use, and we've shown that in this last year with the tax credit.
Representative Poskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. Quick question. What is the occupancy rate on the first 2,200 homes?
So the homes aren't actually finished yet. Okay. They will be soon. And that's why there's that delay where it doesn't really, the money's being spent, you know, the construction's happening. But I think our first developments will actually, our very first funded, state housing funded development will be this spring. We'll be taking occupancy. But if you have time, I really would encourage you to check out this spreadsheet. They are in communities all over the state. And you know, it's something that I travel regularly. I meet with community leaders, and I hear it in every community that one of the biggest obstacles to economic development and to good communities, to revitalization in rural areas, is housing. And we're so grateful to have this resource to roll out the door.
Representative Probst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your presentation today. I saw the spreadsheet here. One of my questions was whether we could get that, but can we also get you talked about the HUD rent schedule? Sure. I would like to look at that to see, so I can look and see, get an idea of what the rent expectations are on some of these properties.
Absolutely. I can follow up with the committee with that. And I should have pointed out, we do have just a very high level overview of not just this program, but all of the different KHRC administered programs in here. There's also like a 3-page report that we submitted to the legislature in January. This credit's new, so we're just kind of getting going, but it does provide some detail on that. Hopefully will address some of your questions, but we can certainly follow up with anything else.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So if we're looking at the 41 projects, a couple questions. Number one, this is all for new builds. It has nothing to do with rehabbing existing homes in our communities.
Great question, Representative. So it's a mix. There are some acquisition rehabs as well as new construction, recognizing that there's just, it's always that battle between how much preservation do we do versus how much growth and opportunity areas around the state.
And I would just make a note that if you travel across the state and you go to small communities or large communities, you see a lot of housing that's in disrepair. It creates a huge amount of blight. Small towns are devastated with their blight. And it seems to me, if I were thinking about making Kansas a better place, I'd want to invest in rehabbing those homes rather than create affordable housing that's going to be in disrepair in probably 20 years and not look so great. Just a thought on that. And then my second question is on those 41 projects, 800 housing units that are mentioned here under economic and fiscal impacts. How many developers might that comprise for those 41 projects?
No, that's another good question. We have a rule in our qualified allocation plan that we can only award, I believe there's maybe 3, we can only award 3 developments to one developer at any given time, just to ensure they have the capacity to finish a job and be efficient with it. So, generally each developer will only have 1 or 2 developments going on at any given time. That's where we've been so successful with this resource. And I always remind committees in our legislature that we're competing with the developers that have these exact same resources available to them in Denver, in Oklahoma City, in Omaha. So if we stop offering some of these incentives, a lot of these development companies that operate in each one of those states will immediately leave our state. We've seen the opposite. We've actually seen more inflow than outflow of developers, which shows the success of this investment.
So basically then if you have 41 different projects, you could have as few as 13 developers taking advantage of this $250 million.
In theory, I'll tell you, and actually it's published on our website, just how many the development companies behind each one. There's a lot more than 13 at any given time. And these are large companies that have general contractors. They've got a lot of different contractors they use, many of them local.
And so we could also, if we went to your website, we would be able to ascertain if they were Kansas developers or they were out-of-state developers.
That's correct.
And then finally, Mr. Chairman, my last question really is to our revisor, and not to answer necessarily today, but just thinking about that transparency database and how we're supposed to have this or access to this. However, there's nothing on this yet, perhaps too soon on the database. There's nothing under this particular category. But my question really is how we transfer credits, because when we transfer credits, I'm not sure that was included. And I think it would be important to see how the credits are moving from one recipient to another recipient. And so whether or not that might already have been included in the statute, or if that's something that this committee might consider. Thank you.
Any further questions? All right, well, that was easy, wasn't it?
Lots of information. I appreciate the chance to speak before you, and always available. So, thank you.
All right, so I did ask a lot of questions today, committee, on this because I'm trying to get my arms around the fiscal impact. But I can tell you that when we passed these bills a year or 2 years ago, that I went around the state with them, and we hosted meetings, and there was a tremendous amount of interest in these programs in areas that really did. One area hadn't even had an application to build a house for 18 years. And now they have a whole area being developed because of this program. So it does make an impact on some cities. It's just, what does it cost is the next question. So thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't think we have anything else on the agenda today, and there's no one else. All right, that's it. Stay tuned. Tomorrow's going to be an exciting day with the contractors. So come on back, everybody. We're going to have a lot of fun. Bring your popcorn.